They were ready to hang her for a loaf of bread. Until one man said something no one could understand. The wind dragged dust across the main street, dry and restless, the kind that settled into your throat and stayed there. And right in the middle of it stood a woman with her wrist caught in a rough grip, her fingers still clutching half a torn piece of bread like it was the last thing tying her to this world, her dark hair falling across her face, hiding eyes that refused to beg, and all around them the town had already decided what she was worth. Voices rising sharp and certain, men shifting on their boots, women watching with that quiet approval that came from fear dressed as righteousness. Because she was Apache, and that was enough. It had always been enough out here. Enough to turn hunger into crime and silence into guilt. And then Elias Turner stepped forward, slow, measured, like a man who didn't belong to the noise, his boots pressing into the dirt with a weight that seemed heavier than the moment itself, his shadow cutting between the crowd and the woman as if drawing a line. No one else could see, and for a second everything held, like the town itself was waiting to hear which way the wind would turn, and he didn't look at the rope someone had already brought out. Didn't look at the sheriff pretending not to notice. He only looked at her. Really looked, past the dust, past the accusation, to the way her hand trembled just slightly around that piece of bread. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise, didn't fight for space. It simply settled over the street, quiet. Enough that people leaned in without realizing. "You don't steal to eat alone," he said, and the words landed wrong. Wrong enough to make a few brows tighten, wrong enough to stall the moment. And then he bent, picked up the rest of the bread from the dirt, brushed it once against his sleeve, and placed it back into her hand, slow, deliberate, like it mattered, like she mattered. "Bring your children too," he added. And that was when the silence broke in a different way, not with shouting but with confusion, the kind that crept in under the skin, because mercy didn't belong here, not like that, not without a cost. And she didn't thank him, didn't move, just stared at him like he had spoken a language she wasn't allowed to understand, like his words carried something heavier than kindness, something dangerous, because out where she came from, debts were not given lightly and never forgotten. And Elias stepped back as if the moment was already over, as if he hadn't just shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. And one by one the voices faded, replaced by glances, by questions. No one dared to ask out loud, and she turned, slow at first, then faster, disappearing past the edge of the buildings with the bread held close against her chest, and the town exhaled like it had been holding its breath too long. But Elias didn't move, not yet, because something in the way she walked, in the way she never looked back, told him this wasn't finished, not even close. And when the sun finally dropped behind the ridge hours later, painting the land in that thin orange light that made everything feel older than it was, he noticed the tracks, not one set, not two, but many, circling just beyond his fence line. Light, careful, patient, like eyes watching from the dark, and he stood there listening to the quiet, knowing without needing proof that somewhere out there, beyond the reach of his lantern, someone was deciding what his words were worth. The night did not settle easy over Elias Turner's ranch. It stretched thin and restless, the kind of darkness that listened back, and the lantern by his door burned longer than usual, its glow spilling across the dry ground where those tracks circled just beyond reach, too careful to be careless, too many to be ignored. And Elias stood there with his hands resting loose at his sides, not on his gun, never on his gun, because he had learned long ago that the fastest way to misunderstand a moment was to greet it with fear. And still, the air carried something heavy, something watching, something weighing his words from earlier like they were a promise or a mistake. And inside the house the table sat untouched, a loaf of bread still resting where he had left it, cut clean, uneaten, as if even he did not know yet what it was meant for. And the wind shifted once, bringing with it the faint scent of wood smoke and leather, distant but certain. And that was when he knew they were closer than the track suggested, closer than the darkness admitted, not hiding, just waiting, measuring him the same way he had measured that woman in the street. And he did not call out, did not reach for light or weapon. He simply turned his back to the night and stepped inside, leaving the door unlatched, not as an invitation, not as a challenge, just as truth. And hours passed slow, marked only by the creak of old wood and the quiet breath of a man who refused to pretend he was alone. And just before dawn, when the sky was still caught between gray and blue, he heard it. Not footsteps, not voices, but the absence of silence, the kind that gathers when many people stand still together. And Elias rose without hurry, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside into the cold edge of morning. And there they were, spread across the rise beyond his fence line, not scattered, not restless, but steady, a line of figures that did not need to move to be seen. And at the front stood the woman from the town, Naya, her posture different now, not hunted, not desperate, but something else, something resolved. And beside her, smaller shapes, children, more than he expected, each one holding something in their hands. And for a long moment no one spoke, the distance between them holding more weight than any words could carry. And Elias took one step forward, then another, stopping just short of the fence, close enough to see the dust on their boots, the stillness in their eyes. And it was the children who moved first, stepping past Naya, one by one, their small hands opening to reveal the pieces of bread he had given, untouched, unbroken further, carried through the night like something fragile, something important. And that was when Elias understood that what he had given was not what they had taken, and what they had brought back was not what he expected. And behind them, more figures emerged from the morning haze, not advancing, not threatening, just present, enough to turn a single act into something larger than one man or one moment. And Elias felt the weight of it settle, not as pressure, but as clarity, because out here, kindness did not disappear into the dust. It traveled, it returned, sometimes as gratitude, sometimes as something harder to name. And Naya finally stepped forward, her eyes meeting his without fear this time, without hesitation, and the silence between them shifted again, no longer uncertain, but unfinished. The distance between them held like a breath that no one wanted to release. And Elias Turner did not reach for words because he understood something now that the town never had. That silence could carry more truth than anything spoken too quickly. And the children stood there with their hands still open, each piece of bread resting untouched, not offered back, not refused, simply held as if it meant something more than food. And Elias let his eyes move from one small face to the next, seeing the same quiet patience, the same careful watching that had followed him through the night. And behind them the line of Apache men and women remained still, not tense, not ready, just present in a way that made the land itself feel shared for the first time since he had set his fence posts into it. And Naya stepped forward again, slow enough to show she was not hiding anything, strong enough to show she did not need to, her eyes meeting his without flinch or apology. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of something older than the town, older than his ranch. They did not eat, she said, and the words settled between them like dust after a long ride. Simple but heavy, and Elias glanced once at the bread in the children's hands, then back at her, not questioning, just waiting, because he had learned that some truths did not need to be pulled, only given time to arrive. And Naya continued, her gaze steady. Not because they were not hungry, she added, and there was a faint shift behind her, a ripple through the line of watchers, as if what she was saying mattered to all of them, not just to him, but because what you gave was not just food. And Elias felt that land deeper than anything she could have explained, because he had not thought of it that way, had not meant it that way. And yet here it was, returned to him as something larger than intention. And one of the children stepped closer then, no more than 10 years old, his boots too worn for his size, his eyes clear and steady, and he held out the piece of bread toward Elias, not in rejection, not in thanks, but in offering, as if asking him to see it the same way they did. And Elias did not take it right away. He let the moment sit, let the morning light grow stronger around them, revealing more faces in the distance, more figures standing just beyond the rise, not hidden, not advancing, simply witnessing. And when he finally reached out, he did not take the bread from the child's hand. He broke off a small piece instead, careful, deliberate, and placed it back into the boy's palm, keeping the rest where it was. And for the first time, a faint shift passed through the children, not quite smiles, not quite relief, but something lighter, something that moved through them like a quiet understanding. And Elias spoke then, his voice low, steady, "No one eats alone," he said, and the words did not belong just to him anymore. They hung there, shared, carried across the space between them, and behind Naya, one of the older men stepped forward, his presence calm but unmistakable, his eyes taking in Elias with the kind of measure that looked past what a man owned and into what he chose, and the air changed again. Not tense, not uncertain, but deeper, as if the moment was about to reveal something it had been holding back since the first step into the street, and Elias stood still, knowing without needing to ask that whatever came next would not be about Brett at all. The older man did not rush his steps, and that alone told Elias more than any show of force ever could, because a man who carried urgency often carried fear behind it. But this one moved like the land itself had agreed to hold him steady, and when he stopped just beyond the children, the space between him and Elias felt deliberate, measured in more than feet, measured in understanding, and for a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes passing over the fence, the house, the worn edges of a life built alone, then settling back on Elias with a quiet weight that did not accuse and did not forgive. It simply saw, and Elias did not shift under it, did not look away, because something in him recognized that this was not a moment for defense or explanation. It was a moment to stand exactly as he was, nothing added, nothing hidden, and the man finally spoke, his voice low, steady, shaped by years of choosing words that mattered. "You gave without asking who would repay," he said, and the sentence carried no praise, no challenge, only truth, and Elias let a small breath leave his chest, not relief, just acknowledgement, because that was all he had done, no more, no less, and behind the man, the line of Apache watchers remained still, but something in their stillness had softened, not broken, just eased, like a hand no longer clenched, and Naya stood slightly to the side now, her place no longer at the front, but not behind either, her eyes moving between Elias and the man as if she understood what this moment balanced on, and the children shifted closer together, their small movements careful, respectful, as though they knew they were part of something larger than themselves, and the man reached slowly to his side, not for a weapon, not for anything hidden, but for a small leather pouch that hung from a worn cord, and he held it in both hands for a second before stepping forward one more pace. Close enough now that the morning light caught the lines of his face, the years, written there not as hardship, but as memory, and he placed the pouch on the top rail of the fence, not pushing it forward, not pulling back, just leaving it there between them, and Elias glanced at it once, noting the careful stitching, the way it had been kept, carried, valued, and then he looked back up, because whatever was inside mattered less than what it represented, and the man's eyes did not leave his as he spoke again. "There are ways to measure a man," he said. "Some use land, some use coin," and his gaze flicked briefly toward the distant hills, then back. "We use what he does when no one stands beside him," and the words settled into the space like something final, something that had been decided long before this morning, and Elias felt the weight of it not as judgment, but as recognition, the kind that did not ask him to be more than he was, only to remain it, and he reached out then, not to take the pouch, but to rest his hand lightly on the fence beside it, a small gesture, but enough to show he understood the line that had been drawn and the trust that now rested on it, and for a brief second, the wind moved through the space between them, lifting dust, brushing coats, and hair, carrying the faint scent of bread and earth together, and in that quiet, unspoken exchange, something shifted that neither side would name out loud, because out here, the strongest agreements were the ones left without words, and the man gave a single nod, slight but certain, and stepped back, returning to his place among his people, leaving the pouch where it lay, and Elias remained where he was, his hand still resting against the wood, knowing that whatever had just been placed before him was not a gift, not a payment, but a beginning. The pouch rested on the fence like it had always belonged there, quiet, patient, waiting for a decision that did not need to be rushed, and Elias Turner kept his hand near it, but not on it, because he understood now that taking it too quickly would turn meaning into transaction, and that was not what this was, not out here where every gesture carried more weight than words ever could. And across from him, the line of Apache men and women held their ground without pressing forward, without stepping back, as if the moment itself had drawn a boundary that both sides chose to respect, and the children still stood closest, their small figures steady despite the long night behind them. Each one watching Elias not with fear, but with something quieter, something that asked a question without needing to speak it. And Elias finally moved, not toward the pouch, but back toward his house, slow and unhurried, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dust that the wind would take by noon. And for a second it looked like he was turning away from all of it, leaving the offering where it lay, refusing to accept whatever had been placed before him. And a faint shift passed through the watchers, not alarm, not disappointment, just awareness, because they were measuring this choice as closely as they had measured the last. And Elias reached his door, pushed it open, and disappeared inside without a word, leaving the morning hanging in that same careful balance. And time stretched just long enough for doubt to take shape, just long enough for anyone watching to wonder if the line between them had been drawn too thin to hold. And then he returned, carrying something in both hands, not hidden, not guarded, just held the way a man carries what matters. And when he stepped back to the fence, the light caught what he brought. Simple things, nothing polished, nothing rare, a second loaf of bread, still warm from the early fire, a small tin cup, and a worn cloth folded tight. And he set them down beside the pouch, not closer to him, not closer to them, but exactly where the space had already been claimed. And for the first time since the morning began, the distance between them felt shared, not divided. And Elias looked up then, meeting the older man's gaze again, his voice low but clear. "If it is a beginning," he said, "it belongs to both sides." And the words settled into the air without challenge, without resistance, because they were not offered as a bargain, only as truth. And Naya's eyes shifted slightly at that, not surprised, but something close to it, as if she had expected many things from him, but not this, not the refusal to turn a moment of meaning into something owned. And behind her, one of the women stepped forward just enough to see more clearly, her expression unreadable but no longer closed. And the children looked down at what Elias had placed, the bread, the cup, the cloth, simple things that spoke without needing explanation. And slowly, almost carefully, the same boy from before stepped forward again, his small boots pressing into the dust as he reached the fence. And this time, when he held out his piece of bread, Elias did not pause. He broke off another piece from his own loaf and placed it into the boy's hand beside the first, not replacing it, not taking it away, just adding to it. And the boy's fingers closed around both pieces, his eyes lifting for a second to meet Elias's. And in that brief glance something passed between them that did not belong to either side alone, something that did not need translation. And behind him, the line of Apache watchers shifted again, not in movement, but in feeling, as if the ground itself had settled under a new kind of understanding. And the older man gave another small nod, slower this time, deeper, and the wind moved through the space once more, carrying the faint scent of bread, leather, and dust. And for the first time since the street, since the moment everything could have gone another way, Elias felt the weight of the morning lift just enough to breathe, not because the distance was gone, but because it no longer needed to be crossed in a single step. The boy stepped back with both pieces of bread held carefully in his hands, as if they carried something fragile that could not be seen. And the moment he rejoined the others, a quiet ripple moved through the children, not excitement, not fear, but a kind of recognition that settled deeper than either. And Elias Turner watched it happen without moving, his hands resting lightly against the worn fence rail, his eyes steady, because he understood now that whatever had begun here was no longer his to control, only his to honor. And the older man across from him shifted his weight just slightly, enough to show that the balance had changed again, not broken, not finished, but moving forward in a way that did not require force. And he turned his head once, just enough for those behind him to see. And in that small motion, something passed through the line of Apache watchers, a silent agreement, a decision carried without words. And one by one, slowly, deliberately, they began to lower themselves, not all at once, not in display, but in quiet sequence, each movement grounded, intentional, as if the earth itself had asked them to kneel. And Elias felt the breath leave his chest without realizing he had been holding it, because he knew what this meant even if no one had said it aloud. This was not surrender, not submission. It was respect given in a language the town would never understand. And he did not step forward, did not raise a hand. He simply stood there, letting the moment exist without trying to shape it into something smaller. And Naya lowered herself last, her gaze never leaving his. And when she finally bent her knee, it was not with hesitation, but with certainty, as if she had already chosen this long before the bread, long before the street, and the children followed, some slower than others, some glancing at the adults before committing, but all of them joining until the line that had once stood across from him now rested in stillness, grounded and quiet, and the land itself seemed to settle around them, the wind easing, the dust falling back to earth, as if even it recognized the weight of what had just been offered. And Elias finally moved, but not toward the pouch, not toward the bread. He stepped to the gate and unlatched it, the old wood creaking softly as it swung open, not wide, not inviting everything at once, just enough to remove the barrier that had defined the space between them. And he stepped back again, giving room, not command, and for a moment nothing happened, the stillness stretching just long enough to remind them all that this choice, like the others, could not be rushed. And then the older man rose first, slow, deliberate, and walked forward, crossing the line where the fence had once stood between them, his step steady, unguarded. And when he reached Elias, he did not reach for the pouch, did not reach for the bread. He simply stood close enough that the space between them no longer carried distance. And he gave a single nod, deeper than before, heavier with meaning, and behind him, the others remained where they were, not following yet, not pressing forward. Because this was not about numbers, not about presence. It was about the moment between two men who had chosen something different when it would have been easier not to, and Elias met that nod with one of his own. Small, steady, and the silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete, like a story that had found its center without needing to be told. The older man stood inside the open gate now, close enough that the dust between his boots and Elias Turner's had nowhere left to settle. And for a long moment neither of them moved, because some distances, once crossed, demanded stillness before anything else, and the quiet around them deepened, not empty, but full, like the land itself was listening to what would come next. And Elias kept his posture easy, not guarded, not welcoming in the way townsfolk understood it, but steady, the way a man stands when he knows there is no need to prove anything. And the older man's eyes moved once more, not over the ranch this time, but over Elias himself, as if confirming something already decided. And then he spoke again, his voice carrying just enough to reach those behind him without ever turning away. A door opened without being asked, he said, and Elias let the words sit, because he knew they were not about the wood and iron at his side. And behind them, the line of Apache watchers remained kneeling, their stillness now something quieter, something grounded, no longer waiting, but witnessing. And Naya rose slowly from where she had lowered herself, her movement deliberate, her eyes still fixed on Elias. And she stepped forward to stand just behind the older man, not speaking, not interrupting, but present in a way that made it clear she belonged to this moment as much as either of them. And the children remained where they were, holding their bread, their small forms steady, their silence no longer uncertain but respectful, as if they understood that what was happening now would shape something they would carry long after the morning was gone. And Elias finally reached for the pouch on the fence, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the same measured care he had shown since the beginning, and he lifted it just enough to feel its weight, the soft give of leather, the quiet promise of whatever rested inside. And he did not open it, not yet. Instead, he turned slightly and set it down on the table just inside the doorway, leaving it in plain sight, not hidden, not claimed. And when he stepped back outside, the older man gave the smallest shift of his head, not approval, not command, just acknowledgement. And for the first time since dawn, one of the Apache men behind him rose and stepped forward, not crossing the gate, not approaching too close, but near enough to place something on the ground just beyond the threshold, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, simple, carefully tied. And then he stepped back again, returning to his place without a word. And Elias watched the bundle for a second, then looked up, meeting the older man's gaze, understanding that this was not an exchange, not a trade, but a continuation. And the older man spoke once more, quieter now, but no less certain. "You gave without counting," he said. "So we return without asking." And the words settled into the morning like something that had always been there, waiting to be heard. And Elias nodded once, slow, steady, and stepped forward to pick up the bundle, feeling its light weight, its careful wrapping. And he held it for a moment before placing it beside the pouch inside the house, not opening either, not yet, because he knew that what mattered was not what they contained, but what they meant. And when he stepped back out again, the sun had risen just enough to cast long shadows across the land, stretching from one side of the fence to the other, no longer divided, just connected by light. And in that quiet, shared space, the older man gave one final nod, and this time, it carried something different, something closer to trust than anything that had come before. The light stretched farther across the land now, thin and pale, touching the fence, the doorway. The figures still gathered beyond the rise, and Elias Turner stood in that quiet space between what had been given and what had not yet been understood, his hands empty again, his posture unchanged, because he knew that some things did not reveal themselves through urgency. And the older man watched him for a moment longer, his gaze steady but no longer measuring, as if whatever needed to be known had already been seen. And behind him, the line of Apache men and women began to shift, not in retreat, not in departure, but in a subtle loosening, like a held breath finally released. And one by one, slowly, they rose from where they had knelt, their movements quiet, deliberate, each person returning to their feet with the same care they had shown in lowering themselves. And the children followed, some glancing at Elias as they stood, others looking toward Naya, waiting for something unspoken to guide them. And she gave it with a single look, a small nod that carried more certainty than any command. And the children began to move, not toward the house, not across the gate, but back toward the line they had come from, each step light but purposeful, as if they were carrying something invisible with them now, something that could not be set down. And Elias watched them go, his eyes steady, his expression unchanged, but something in the way he stood had shifted, something quieter, deeper, as if he understood that what had happened here would not end with their departure. And the older man turned then, not away from Elias, but slightly to the side, enough to face both him and his people at once. And he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to reach those behind him without breaking the stillness. "A man fed hunger without asking its name," he said, and the words settled into the morning like a marker, something that would remain long after the dust had settled. And he paused, letting the silence hold it, then added, softer now, "So we leave him with something that does not fade." And Elias felt that before he understood it, felt it in the way the air seemed to still around the words, in the way Naya's gaze lowered, just slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. And then the older man stepped back, returning to the line, and for a moment it seemed as though that would be all, that the morning would close as quietly as it had opened. But then Naya moved again, stepping forward once more, alone this time, her pace unhurried, her posture steady. And when she reached the fence, she did not stop on her side. She stepped through the open gate, crossing the space Elias had left unclaimed, and she came to stand just a few feet from him, close enough that the dust between them no longer mattered. And she held something in her hands, small, wrapped in a strip of worn cloth. And for a moment she said nothing, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that carried no fear, no hesitation, only truth. And then she extended her hands, offering the small bundle without pushing it forward, without forcing it into his grasp, simply holding it where he could choose. And when Elias reached out and took it, her fingers released it without resistance. And she spoke, her voice low, steady. "This is not payment," she said, and the words carried more weight than anything that had come before. "It is memory." And Elias held the bundle for a second, feeling its shape, its quiet presence. And when he looked up again, she had already stepped back, returning to her place, leaving him standing there with something that did not belong to the past or the present, but to whatever came next. And the wind moved once more across the land, carrying with it the faint scent of bread, leather, and something else, something older, something that would not be forgotten. The bundle rested in Elias Turner's hands with a weight that did not belong to what it was made of, something quiet, something lasting. And he stood there for a long moment after Naya stepped back, the space between them opening again, but no longer empty, no longer uncertain. And the line of Apache men and women began to turn, not all at once, not in any hurried motion, but with the same calm purpose that had brought them there. One by one, stepping away from the fence, from the house, from the moment that had settled between two worlds without needing to be named. And the children followed, their small figures moving in soft rhythm behind the adults, each still holding their pieces of bread, though now they no longer held them like something fragile, but like something understood. And Elias watched them go without calling out, without offering anything more, because he knew that whatever needed to be given had already been placed into the air between them, into the ground beneath their feet, and it did not belong to words anymore. And the older man was the last to turn, pausing once at the rise just beyond the fence, his silhouette catching the full light of the morning now. And he looked back, not long, not searching, just enough to mark the place. And then he gave a final nod, small and certain, before stepping away and disappearing with the others into the wide stretch of land that did not hold grudges and did not keep score. And the silence that followed was different now, not heavy, not waiting, but settled, like something had been completed without needing to be closed. And Elias remained where he was until the last trace of movement faded, until even the dust had forgotten their passing, and only then did he turn, walking slowly back toward the house, the bundle still in his hands, the pouch and the cloth-wrapped offering waiting just inside. And when he stepped through the doorway, the light shifted again, softer now, filtering through the worn boards and the quiet of a place that had never held so much meaning before. And he set the bundle down beside the others, not opening any of them, not yet, because he understood that whatever they contained was not meant to answer anything, only to remind. And he stood there for a moment, looking at the table, at the bread, at the simple things that had carried something far beyond themselves. And then he reached for the loaf he had baked that morning, breaking off a piece and holding it in his hand, not eating it, just feeling its warmth, its weight, the way it had changed everything without trying to. And outside, the wind moved again across the land, carrying the same quiet scent of dust and leather and something else that lingered just beneath it, something that did not belong to one side or the other anymore. And Elias stepped back out onto the porch, the piece of bread still in his hand, and he looked out across the open land where the fence no longer felt like a boundary, only a line that had once been necessary and now was not. And he took a breath, slow and steady, and without speaking, he set the bread down on the edge of the railing, not as an offering, not as a sign, just as something left where it might be needed. And he turned away, stepping back inside without looking again, because out here, some things did not need to be watched to be understood. And the wind carried on, quiet, endless, as if it knew that what had been given would not be taken back, and what had been shared would not be forgotten. They say a man reveals his true weight not when he has plenty, but when he's down to his last bite, and still chooses to give it away. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your town or state below, and if you believe kindness still matters out here where the dust don't forgive, stay with me, because this story don't end the way you think it does. The sun hung low over the dry Texas plains, burning through a sky so empty it felt like God had forgotten this patch of land. And Ethan Cole stood in the doorway of a ranch that barely deserved the name, one hand resting against the splintered frame, the other holding the last piece of bread he had left, hard as stone, barely enough to keep a man standing through the night. And that's when he saw them. Two shapes stumbling through the heat haze about 30 yards out, moving slow, uneven, like the land itself was trying to pull them back under. He narrowed his eyes, the brim of his hat cutting the glare, and for a second he thought they might be ghosts, because no one walked this far out unless they had nowhere left to go. But ghosts don't stumble, and ghosts don't fall to their knees the way the woman did, her body folding into the dust like something that had already given up. The child beside her tried to hold her up, small hands gripping fabric that had long since stopped offering protection, eyes too tired to cry, too dry to beg. And Ethan felt that old instinct tighten in his chest, the one that told him to step back, shut the door, let the desert decide who stayed and who didn't, because he'd learned that lesson the hard way, learned it in the silence that follows helping the wrong person, Learned it in the kind of nights where regret don't let you sleep. He took a breath, slow, measured, tasting dust, and something else, something heavier, like a memory he didn't want to name, and for a moment, he didn't move. The woman looked up then, her eyes catching the light just enough for him to see what was left in them. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to warning, like she was telling him without words that stepping forward might cost him more. Then he understood. The child leaned into her, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear, and the sound carried across the dry air like a thread ready to snap. He glanced down at the bread in his hand, turned it once between his fingers, feeling the rough edge press into his skin, the last thing standing between him and another empty night, another long stretch of waiting for something that might never come. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of dust and worn leather, and in that quiet, with nothing but the sun watching, Ethan Cole made a choice that didn't feel like courage and didn't feel like mercy, just something he couldn't walk away from. And he stepped off that porch, closing the distance one slow pace at a time, not knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, that single step was already echoing louder than thunder. The distance between them felt longer than 30 yards once he started walking, each step dragging through heat that pressed against his chest like a warning he could not quite hear, and the woman did not move. Did not try to rise again, only watched him with those dark, steady eyes that carried something older than fear, something that measured him in a way no man ever had. Ethan slowed when he was 10 feet away, stopping just outside the space that felt like it belonged to them, his boots. Sinking slightly into the dry earth, the wind lifting a strand of the woman's hair across her face, and the child shifted closer to her side, small fingers tightening against her sleeve, as if holding on to the last piece of the world that still made sense. He crouched down slowly, careful, the way you approach a wounded animal that might bolt if you move too fast, and he held out the bread without a word, his hand steady even though something in his chest was not. The woman's gaze dropped to the bread, then back to his face. And for a moment nothing happened, just the sound of wind brushing over empty land and the faint creak of leather from his belt. "Take it," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, not unkind, just unused to being offered. The child reached first, hesitation flickering in the small movement, and Ethan did not pull back, did not rush, just kept his hand there until the bread was gone from his palm, and the child held it like something fragile, something unreal. The woman spoke then, her voice low, careful with each word as if the language itself did not belong to her fully. "You should not," she said. And there was no anger in it, no gratitude either, just a statement that landed heavier than either. Ethan gave a small shrug, almost to himself. "It is just bread," he replied, though they both knew it was not just that. The child broke it in half, offering part back to the woman, and she hesitated again before taking it, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face as if trying to understand what kind of man gives away the last thing he has and expects nothing in return. He reached for the canteen at his side, unscrewing the cap and setting it on the ground between them, not handing it directly, not crossing whatever line he could not see but could feel. And the child drank first this time, slow, careful sips, like someone who had learned the hard way that too much too fast can hurt more than help. The woman followed, then set the canteen back exactly where he had placed it, a small motion that felt deliberate, respectful in a way he did not fully understand. "There is shade," Ethan said after a moment, nodding back toward the barn, its wooden frame casting a narrow strip of relief against the heat. "You can rest there." The woman looked past him, toward the ranch, toward the quiet that surrounded it. And something in her expression tightened, not refusal, not acceptance, something in between. "They will come," she said softly, and this time the words carried weight, not warning for herself, but for him. Ethan frowned slightly, glancing out toward the horizon as if expecting to see something moving out there, but the land stayed empty, stretched wide and silent under the sun. "There is no one out here," he answered, more out of habit than certainty. The woman shook her head once, slow, certain, and pushed herself to her feet with effort that showed in every movement, the child rising with her, still holding what remained of the bread. For a second, Ethan thought she might refuse the shelter, might turn and keep walking into a place that offered nothing but distance. But instead she stepped past him, careful not to touch, moving toward the shade he had offered like someone stepping into something unknown. Ethan remained where he was, watching them go, the empty weight of his hand still remembering the bread that was no longer there. And far beyond the line where sky met land, something unseen had already begun to move. The shade inside the barn was thin, but it felt like stepping into another world. The air cooler by just enough to let a person breathe without fighting for it. And Naya lowered herself onto the rough wooden floor with a quiet control that hid how close she had come to falling again, while the child, Tala, stayed close at her side, chewing slowly, carefully, like every bite carried weight beyond hunger. Ethan remained at the doorway for a long moment, watching the way they moved, the way they avoided touching anything they did not need, the way their eyes tracked every corner of the space as if memorizing it, measuring it, deciding whether it could be trusted. He had seen people pass through this land before, drifters, traders, lost souls with nowhere better to go. But this was different. There was a stillness to them that did not belong to exhaustion alone, something held tight beneath the surface. He stepped inside finally, boots soft against the packed dirt, and reached for an old blanket draped over a wooden rail, shaking the dust from it before placing it a few feet away from where they sat. Not too close, not forcing the distance to close faster than it should. "It is not much," he said, his voice low, and the words felt unnecessary the moment they left him, because they both already knew that. Naya inclined her head slightly, a gesture that was not quite thanks but carried respect in a way he could feel even if he did not fully understand it. Tala leaned into the blanket, small shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had seen them, and the sight settled something uneasy in Ethan's chest, though it did not bring peace. Not yet. Outside, the wind shifted again, slipping through the cracks in the barn walls, carrying the dry scent of the plains and something else, something distant and faint that made Ethan glance toward the open doorway without knowing why. "You said they will come," he spoke after a while, the words sitting between them like something that needed to be faced before the sun went down. "Who?" Naya did not answer right away, her gaze fixed on Tala as the child finished the last of the bread, brushing crumbs from her hands with care that seemed taught, not instinctive. When Naya finally looked up, her eyes met his with a steadiness that made him feel like he had already stepped further into something than he could see the end of. "My people," she said simply, and the way she said it made the words feel larger than the barn, larger than the land stretching beyond it. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose, nodding once as if that answered more than it did, because out here, everyone belonged to someone. Even if they pretended otherwise, then they will find you safe, he replied, leaning his shoulder against the wooden frame, though the certainty in his voice was thinner than he would have liked. Naya studied him for a moment longer, then shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but as if adjusting a thought he had not fully formed. "Safe is not the same as understood," she said, and the words lingered in the quiet, heavier than any warning he had heard before. Ethan frowned, not at her, but at the space between what he thought he had done and what she seemed to be telling him. And for the first time since he had stepped off that porch, a small, quiet doubt took root in his mind, the kind that does not shout but stays, waiting for the moment it proves itself right. And outside, far beyond the reach of the eye, something continued moving closer, steady, certain, and unseen. The sun had begun its slow drop toward the horizon, stretching shadows long and thin across the dry ground. And inside the barn the air carried a quieter weight now, the kind that settles after hunger has been pushed back just enough to let the body remember it is still alive. Ethan stood near the open doorway, his eyes drifting between the empty land outside and the two figures resting behind him, his hand occasionally brushing against the edge of his belt as if checking for something that was not there, something he had stopped relying on a long time ago. Tala had fallen asleep against the folded blanket, her breathing soft, steady, the kind of rest that only comes when exhaustion finally loosens its grip, and Naya remained awake, sitting upright, her back straight despite the fatigue that still clung to her movements. Her gaze not fixed on Ethan now, but on the light, shifting along the barn wall, as if measuring time by its slow retreat. "You should go inside your house," she said after a while, her voice quiet but certain, and it was not a suggestion, not really. Ethan let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "This is as inside as it gets," he answered, glancing around at the worn beams and the gaps where sunlight slipped through. "House does not offer much more than this." Naya turned her eyes back to him then, studying him again, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to understanding, as if she was placing him somewhere in a story she already knew. "Then you should leave," she said, and that landed differently, sharper, cutting through the quiet that had settled between them. Ethan frowned slightly, shifting his weight. "It is my land," he replied, not defensive, just stating what he had always believed to be true. Naya held his gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them tightening with something that was not quite conflict, but not agreement either. "Land does not belong the way you think," she said finally, and the words were not spoken to challenge him, but to correct something deeper. Ethan looked away then, out toward the horizon again, the line where the sky met the earth blurring slightly in the late afternoon light, and he did not answer, because there was no answer he could give that would not sound hollow even to his own ears. The wind shifted once more, stronger this time, pushing a thin wave of dust across the yard, and Ethan narrowed his eyes, focusing on the distance, something in the movement catching his attention, not shape, not yet, just a change in the way the air carried itself. He stepped forward, out of the barn and into the open, boots pressing into the dry ground as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The horizon still empty at first glance, but the longer he looked, the more something began to form, a faint line, low and wide, like the land itself was beginning to stir. Behind him, Naya rose to her feet without a sound, her presence shifting the air in the doorway, and she did not need to ask what he saw, because she already knew. Ethan felt it before he fully understood it, that quiet, rising certainty that something was coming, something large enough to change the way this day would be remembered. And for the first time since he had stepped off that porch, the choice he had made began to feel less like a simple act and more like the beginning of something he could no longer turn away from. While far out across the plains, the faint line on the horizon grew just enough to break the stillness of the world. The line on the horizon did not move fast, but it did not need to, because the longer Ethan stared at it, the more it grew, spreading wider across the land like something deliberate, something that knew exactly where it was going. The air felt different now, heavier, carrying a faint tremor that did not come from wind alone, and Ethan stepped a few paces forward into the open yard, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat as he tried to count shapes where there were still only shadows. Behind him, he heard Tala stir, the soft shift of fabric against wood, and Naya's voice murmuring something low and steady, not fear, not urgency, but something closer to acceptance, as if this moment had already been lived in her mind long before it reached his. "How many?" Ethan asked without turning, his voice calm in a way that surprised even him. Naya stepped to the edge of the barn doorway, the fading light outlining her figure against the dim interior, and she did not need to look long. "Enough," she said, and that single word carried more truth than any number he could have guessed. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound lost in the growing hush that seemed to settle over the land itself, even the wind easing as if the world was making room for what was coming. He glanced back once, just once, at the barn, at the small figure of Tala now awake, watching with wide, quiet eyes that held no panic, only a kind of knowing that did not belong to someone her age. And then he looked forward again, because whatever was coming was not for her to face alone. The shapes became clearer now, breaking into riders, dozens at first, then more, their movement steady, organized, not rushed, not scattered, but unified in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten with something he could not name, because this was not how men rode when they came for trouble. This was something else, something older. The ground beneath his boots seemed to hum faintly as the distance closed, and still, no one raised a weapon, no one broke formation, just a long, quiet approach that stretched time thin, making every second feel like it carried more weight than it should. Ethan let his hands fall to his sides, empty, visible, the way a man stands when he knows there is no point pretending otherwise, and yet he did not step back, did not retreat toward the house or the barn. because something in him refused to turn away from the consequence of his own choice. Beside the doorway, Naya stood still, her posture straight, her presence no longer fragile. No longer the figure he had found in the dust hours ago, but something steadier, something that belonged to the approaching line in a way he did not. "They will see what you did," she said quietly, not looking at him, her eyes fixed on the riders as they drew closer. "But they will not see it the way you do." Ethan swallowed once, the dry air catching in his throat, and nodded slightly, though the motion felt incomplete, unfinished, because he was beginning to understand that this was not about what he meant or what he believed, but about something far beyond his reach. The first riders were close. Enough now for him to see details, the lines of their faces, the stillness in their posture, the absence of urgency. And as the line stretched behind them farther than he could count, the truth settled in fully. Quiet and undeniable, this was not a handful, not a group, but something far larger, something that turned his small, failing ranch into the center of a moment he had never asked for, and yet had already shaped with a single piece of bread. The riders did not rush, and that was what made the moment stretch tighter with every passing second, because men who come fast bring noise and chaos, but men who move like this bring something else entirely, something measured, something already decided. Ethan stood his ground about 20 yards from the barn, the dry earth beneath his boots holding firm as if the land itself wanted to see how this would end, his arms loose at his sides, his hands empty, because anything else would have been a lie. The first line of riders slowed, then stopped in unison, horses settling into stillness with a discipline that spoke louder than any raised voice. And behind them the line continued, stretching far across the plain until it blurred into distance, more than Ethan could count, more than he had ever seen gathered in one place. No one spoke at first, no one reached for anything, and the silence that followed their arrival pressed in from all sides, thick and heavy, broken only by the soft shift of leather and the quiet breath of animals standing at rest. Ethan felt the weight of their attention before he fully met it, hundreds of eyes resting on him, not wild, not chaotic, but focused, steady, and he lifted his chin just enough to meet it, not as a challenge, not as surrender, simply as a man who had nowhere else to stand. From the center of the front line, one rider stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his presence drawing the rest of the scene into focus without effort, and even before he stopped 10 yards from Ethan, it was clear that this was the one the others followed. He dismounted with a calm that carried authority, boots touching the ground with a quiet certainty, and for a moment he did not move closer, did not speak, just studied Ethan the way a man studies something that has already crossed into his world whether it belongs there or not. Behind Ethan, the barn door creaked softly as Naya stepped out, Tala close at her side, and the shift in the air was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, as if the presence of the two worlds in one place had finally been acknowledged. The man's gaze moved to them, and something in his expression changed, not softened, but deepened, like a piece of a larger story had just been confirmed. He reached into a small pouch at his side, and withdrew something Ethan could not see clearly at first, holding it in his palm before stepping forward the final few feet, and stopping just short of the space between them. Ethan's eyes dropped to the object, then back to the man's face, and the distance between understanding and confusion narrowed without closing. "You gave," the man said finally, his voice steady, carrying across the quiet without needing force. The words shaped carefully in a language not fully his, but spoken with intention. Ethan nodded once, slow. "I had something to give," he answered, though even as he said it, the simplicity of the statement felt smaller than the moment around him. The man held the object out slightly, and now Ethan could see it clearly, a small piece of bread, broken, worn at the edges, something that should have meant nothing, and yet here it was, carried across miles, held like something that mattered. "And you took," the man continued, his gaze steady, and that was where the ground shifted beneath Ethan's understanding, because he had not thought of it that way, not even once. Ethan frowned faintly, the first crack in his calm showing through, and for a moment he did not answer, because he did not yet know what had been taken, only that whatever it was, it had brought 500 men to his door. The words did not land all at once, they settled slowly, like dust after a long ride, and Ethan stood there trying to measure something he could not yet see, his eyes flicking once more to the small piece of bread resting in the man's palm, then back to the man himself, searching for the meaning hidden between those few quiet words. "I did not take anything," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but lower now, as if the ground beneath it had shifted just enough to make him careful. "They were starving. I gave what I had, that is all." The man watched him without interruption, without judgment in the way Ethan understood it. But there was weight in that gaze, the kind that did not rush to correct or accuse, only waited for truth to show itself. Behind Ethan, he could feel Naya's presence, still and silent, and that silence carried more than any words she had spoken so far, because she was not stepping forward to explain, not rushing to stand between him and what was unfolding, and that alone told him this was not something she could fix for him. The man lowered his hand slightly, the bread still visible, still central, and then he spoke again, slower this time, choosing each word with care. "In our world, a man does not give without crossing into what is not his." Ethan's brow tightened, the meaning brushing against him but not yet settling, and he shook his head once, faintly. "I did not cross anything," he answered. Though the certainty in his voice had thinned, the man's gaze shifted past him, to Naya, and for the first time Ethan turned as well, following that look, seeing her not as the figure he had pulled from the edge of survival, but as something else, something that carried place and meaning beyond what he had seen. She met the man's eyes with quiet steadiness, and there was no fear there, no apology, only a calm acknowledgement that something had happened and now stood waiting to be understood. "You touched her," the man said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, and Ethan felt that small moment return to him, the river of dust, the weight of her as he steadied her, the instinct that had guided his hands without asking permission. "I kept her from falling," Ethan replied, his voice softer now, because even as he said it, he could hear how simple it sounded compared to what was being placed before him. The man inclined his head slightly, as if accepting the truth of that, but not its completeness. "And in doing so, you stepped where only her people stand," he said, and this time the words settled fully, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. Ethan felt it then, the quiet shift inside him, the realization that what had been natural to him, necessary even, might have carried a meaning he had never been taught to see. And for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would undo that step. The wind moved through the gathered riders, lifting dust in small circles that faded as quickly as they rose, and still no one moved. No one broke the stillness, because this was not a moment for reaction, but for recognition. Ethan turned back to the man, meeting his gaze again, and this time there was no defense in it, only a steady willingness to face whatever came next. "Then I crossed without knowing," he said quietly, and the admission did not weaken him. It grounded him, made him stand more firmly in the space he had already entered. The man studied him for a long breath, the silence stretching just enough to make the next moment matter, and somewhere in that stillness, the distance between judgment and understanding began to narrow, though it had not yet closed. The silence held for one long breath after Ethan's words, the kind of silence that does not empty a place but fills it, pressing against every man and every thought until something true is forced to the surface. And the leader did not look away, did not rush to answer, only studied the man in front of him as if weighing not the mistake, but the meaning behind it. The wind eased across the open land, carrying dust in slow, fading lines, and behind him, the 500 riders remained still, not restless, not impatient, but waiting in a way that suggested this moment mattered more than anything that had brought them here. The leader lowered his hand fully now, the small piece of bread still resting in his palm, and then, without breaking eye contact, he let it fall gently to the ground between them, not discarded, not dismissed, but returned to the earth as if its purpose had been fulfilled. "You crossed without knowing," he said, his voice steady, neither harsh nor forgiving, simply clear, "but you did not turn away when you could have." And that was where the weight shifted, not in what had been done, but in what had been chosen. Ethan felt that shift before he fully understood it, the tightness in his chest easing just enough to let something else take its place, something quieter, something that did not demand defense. The leader stepped forward then, one deliberate pace, closing the distance between them until only a few feet remained, and still Ethan did not move, did not step back, because whatever line had been crossed earlier had already brought him here, and retreat would not change that. Behind him, Naya stood with Tala at her side, her posture steady, her gaze no longer distant, but present, watching not as someone waiting to be judged, but as someone witnessing the outcome of something that belonged to more than one world. The leader turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence, and in that small movement, Ethan saw something pass between them, not words, not gestures, but understanding, quiet and complete. Then the leader faced Ethan again, and what came next was not what Ethan had prepared himself for, not what any man alone on a failing ranch would expect when faced with 500 riders who had crossed miles of open land. The leader bent his knees slowly, deliberately, lowering himself until one knee touched the dust, his head inclining just enough to mark the gesture, and the sound that followed was not loud, not sudden, but it spread outward like a ripple across still water, one after another, the riders behind him doing the same, until the entire line of men, stretching farther than Ethan could see, had lowered themselves in unison, not in submission, not in defeat, but in recognition. Ethan did not move, could not move, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something deeper, because no man prepares for a moment like this. No man expects that the consequence of a single act might look like this, feel like this, carry this kind of weight. The leader spoke again, his voice unchanged, steady as before. "You gave when you had nothing," he said, "and you chose life when you did not understand the cost." And then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch the moment just a little further, he added, "We choose to understand the man who made that choice." And in that quiet, with 500 men kneeling in the dust and the sun dipping low behind them, Ethan Cole stood in a place that was no longer just his land, no longer just their world, but something shared, something fragile, something earned in a way that could not be taken back. The dust settled slowly after the last man lowered himself, and for a long moment, nothing moved, not the riders, not the horses, not even the wind that had carried them across miles of open land, and Ethan stood there in the center of it, a man who had started the day with nothing but a piece of bread, and now found himself holding something far heavier, something he had never asked for and could not quite name. The sun dipped lower, stretching golden light across the kneeling figures, turning the moment into something that felt less like a meeting and more like a memory already forming, the kind people speak about in quiet voices years later. Ethan let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling as the weight of what had happened settled into him. Not all at once, but in pieces, the bread, the touch, the warning, the line on the horizon, and now this. 500 men choosing to kneel not because they had to, but because they had decided to see something beyond the surface. He glanced back over his shoulder, just briefly, at the barn, at Tala standing close to Naya, her small hand resting against her mother's side, and for the first time since he had seen them, there was no tension in that posture, no quiet readiness to flee, only stillness, the kind that comes when a storm has passed and left something different in its place. Naya met his eyes then, and there was something new there, not just understanding, but recognition, as if the space between their worlds had shifted just enough to let them stand on the same ground without losing themselves. Ethan turned back to the leader, who remained kneeling, his presence steady, unchanged by the gesture, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because words felt smaller than what had already been said without them. Ethan lowered his gaze slightly, not out of submission, but out of respect he had not known how to give before, and when he spoke, his voice carried that change, quiet, grounded. "I did not know the cost," he said. The words simple, but this time they held the weight of everything that had followed. The leader inclined his head once, acknowledging not the mistake, but the truth in it, and slowly he rose to his feet, the movement unhurried, controlled, and as he stood, the ripple moved outward again, the riders behind him rising in the same measured way, until the entire line was standing once more, not towering, not threatening, just present. The light caught on their faces, on the edges of their clothing, on the stillness in their eyes, and for a brief moment, The land did not feel divided, did not feel claimed or contested. It simply held them all, equally, without choosing sides. The leader stepped back, creating space again, and the distance between him and Ethan returned, but it did not feel the same as before, because something had already crossed it and could not be undone. "Remember," the leader said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Ethan alone. "Sometimes the right thing is not understood at first, even by those it saves." And with that, he turned, not sharply, not with finality, but with the calm of someone who knew the moment had reached its end. The riders began to move, not all at once, but in a slow, steady shift, turning back toward the open land they had come from, their presence fading into the horizon the same way it had appeared, leaving behind only dust, silence, and something else, something that stayed. Ethan remained where he was long. After they had gone, the empty yard stretching out before him, the barn at his back, and the memory of 500 men kneeling in the dirt resting somewhere deep in his chest. And as the last trace of movement disappeared into the distance, he understood something he had never been taught, that out here, a man is not remembered for what he keeps, but for what he gives away when he has nothing left, and for the first time in a long while. The silence did not feel empty.